Hey y'all. So recently I was asked by a friend of mine about the question, if somebody does good purely for the sake of a higher power, purely for the sake of a benefit in the afterlife, doesn't that make them selfish? Does that make them a good person? And this is a very common question you find in lots of discussions of this nature, morality, philosophy, so on and so forth. And while lots of people have lots of unique, interesting answers to it, I have been recently reading a book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. And in that huge tome, 800 pages, it's more of a long-term relationship than a book. There, in that work, he's tracing the history of how Latin Christendom, how the geographical area of historical Western Europe went from Christianity, went from that dominant worldview to the modern secular world that we have today. That's why it's called A Secular Age. And he takes his time very much breaking down how this phenomenon came to be. A big part of this history of his is answering this very question. How did this morality of secular humanism, doing things not for the sake of any sort of explicitly religious or metaphysical purpose, but purely for the sake of human flourishing, secular humanism, this idea of doing good just for the sake of being good to your fellow humans. How did this idea come about? Now, his narrative I found very interesting, and so that's what I would like to expound upon here. He starts off with the point that secular humanism, this idea of doing good purely for the sake of human flourishing, purely for the sake of your fellow man, that is an idea, it's a very unique phenomenon that only came about in historical Europe. And through colonization and modernity, it spread to the rest of the world. But before that, in Europe itself, and throughout the entire world, this idea of secular humanism never developed anywhere else. In all other parts of the world and in historical Europe, there was always a higher religious ethic. There was always a metaphysics that this ethic was based in. In Europe itself, it was the Catholic Church. It was the Thomistic Aristotelian synthesis, the ideas of Thomas Aquinas and the ideas of Aristotle very much synthesized in the Catholic tradition that was the metaphysics behind the morality of the people in Latin Christendom. And so when they did good, when they were moral, when they acted in a good way, the definition of that was, according to their Christian faith, it was for the purpose of making God happy, and it was by the power of God and the guidance of God. This same idea of doing good for a higher metaphysical purpose was found in all parts of the world, and it was the norm. So how did this come about? How did secular humanism come about? There's lots of different factors that go into the narrative, but one huge aspect of it was the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther posted his objections to the Catholic Church and Catholic doctrine, and he began that Protestant Reformation. This Reformation had lots of unintended consequences, and it was a key part of what led to secularization of the entire modern world in and of itself. There's a great book on this topic. It's called The Unintended Reformation. And there, the author, as well as here with the Charles Taylor, very much documents the history of how through very many different factors, this Reformation ultimately led to secular modernity that we have today. Now, zooming back in, the Protestants, and in particular the Calvinists who came out of the Reformation, they had many interesting aspects of their theology that affected the type of societies that they built. And part of it is this phenomenon that I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's called the Protestant work ethic. This idea that Protestant societies create hardworking, industrious, orderly societies. And this was very much true. Part of Calvinist theology was that every person should have a vocation, for example. Every person should dedicate themselves to a craft, and they should hone their skills in that craft, and that craft should be the way they give back to society. So if a person at a young age decides that they're going to be a carpenter, they develop their skills of carpentry and they give back to the society through that means, and that becomes their vocation. It becomes what's important, it becomes a sanctified way of living. Before the Protestant Revolution, there were different levels of Christians. There was the monks and the nuns who lived a celibate lifestyle, who prayed in monasteries, and these were seen as being more holy or being better Christians. And separate to them, you had the rest of society who lived their own lives, who were still belonging to the faith, but who didn't live as sanctified lives. one of the big objections of the Protestant Reformation as a whole, and Calvinist theology in particular, was we shouldn't have different levels of believers. Rather, every life should be sanctified. Every life should be a clear path towards God. No one life should be inherently better than the other. And so monasteries and nuns and that entire monastic lifestyle was rejected, and instead every ordinary life was seen to be sanctified. And so Calvinist societies and Protestant societies, they focused on developing and creating orderly societies. And this is something that should be recognized, and flowers should be given to these traditions, because as different historians have noted, the degree of order that these Protestant societies achieved is very much unique in human history. So Taylor mentions how the societies in New England, the societies in Holland, these Protestant Calvinist societies, they were orderly to a degree that was rarely seen before. And this was very much motivated by their faith. But there was a temptation, and there was the beginnings of an issue. As the Calvinist societies were creating more and more orderly societies, as these more and more orderly societies were spreading throughout the rest of Europe, even Catholic Europe, there was a temptation, right? Initially, the people are creating orderly societies. The motivating factor for this is their belief in God, right? And the end goal, the goal that they're working towards, is also God. And that they're doing this, they're achieving human flourishing for the sake of God, in order to achieve heaven, in order to achieve the pleasure of God. And also they're doing it in their own minds, according to their own theology, by the power of God, not by their own power. But as they find more and more success, right, as they achieve in creating these human flourishing societies, these orderly societies, the temptation creeps in of seeing their success as being from their own power and not by the power of God, and forgetting about the ultimate goal of arriving at God's pleasure or achieving heaven in the afterlife, and rather working towards the goal of human flourishing in and of itself. So initially you had a society that's working, that's achieving human flourishing, that's very orderly. But two things, they're doing it by the power of God, according to their faith, and they're doing it for the sake of God, and for the sake of achieving God's pleasure and achieving greatness in the afterlife. And so all you have to do in order to arrive at the secularist humanism that we have today is you have to remove God as the goal and heaven as the goal, and you have to remove God as the motivating factor. Now you're creating orderly societies and you're achieving human flourishing purely for its own sake. And this temptation, initially, it was just a temptation, right? Society was still largely Christian. Society was still largely believing. But that temptation was always there. As the centuries went on, as these societies achieved more and more power, more and more flourishing, as they succeeded more and more, along with very many other factors, this temptation grew and grew and grew, such that you have today, it is the default in secular modernist societies. And that we do things for the sake of flourishing, right? When you ask people, why do you do what you do? Whatever vocation they have, whatever job they have, their doctor, their teacher, so on and so forth, the answer they'll typically give is, I do what I do in order to help people. I do what I do, human flourishing. They have this goal that has nothing to do with a higher power, with any sort of metaphysics that they explicitly attribute themselves to. Now, the person could still be a believer. It's not saying that the person is not a believer, but the automatic response that comes to mind for a lot of us is, I'm doing it to help people. And this is very unique in human history. If you were to go back maybe 500 to 1,000 years ago, if you go to Baghdad, if you go to rural Somalia, for example, and you ask the people there, why do you do what you do? The answer typically would be one rooted in their metaphysics or their religious traditions. It would be very much, I'm doing it for the sake of God. This is the correct way of doing things. This is the divine order that's been set out and I'm just playing my part in it, so on and so forth. And so this, in short, in summary, is how this idea of doing good purely for the sake of your fellow human came about. And understanding the history of how secularism, humanism came about, helps you appreciate the situation that we're in now. And so whether you individually think that people who do good for the sake of a benefit in the afterlife or for the sake of pleasing God, whether you believe those people are selfish or not, that's your decision that you have to make. But when you understand the history of how your own secular humanism came about, it puts things into perspective. And so that's all I had for today. If you have any thoughts, do let me know. And until next time.